Hello and welcome to the Business of What's Next. I'm your host, Matthew Shipp, and today I am here with Noel Sobelman at Excel Management Group and author of the book, Innovation Portfolio Management, Linking Strategy to Execution. This show explores how ambitious leaders cut through the noise, decide what matters, and sets up their business for what's next. Noel, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Matt. Great to be here.
So take us through what got you started to what you do. I mean, I was looking at your LinkedIn, and you've been through a lot of innovation, sort of strategy management and stuff. Take us through that and how you got into that.
Yeah, I started my career as an engineer and worked mostly in high tech, large established companies like Motorola and Honeywell. Back to graduate school, and after graduate school, since then I've been working again mostly in technology driven companies, everything from cell phones to storage, and then I made the transition into consulting or doing
Hmm.
advisory work. So I've spent about half my career in consulting, half in industry. And I've always kind of, when in industry, I've kind of raised my hand and volunteered to be the one that's going to lead the process improvement effort. So
Okay.
for some reason, I always gravitated towards just that continuous improvement mindset. And maybe it's the engineer in me, but always working on cross-functional teams to help drive change, drive improvement, whether it be in product development or idea generation or any element of the innovation uh, cycle there.
Hmm.
But one common theme throughout, I've always been in the innovation space, product development, helping companies create new sources of growth, managing portfolios of projects, which my new book is about. So I've had a fun time in the consulting side. What I like about it is I get to work across different industries, so I don't have
Hmm.
to. I can I get the variety of working in everything from semiconductors to hair care products. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
kind of fun. A lot of the principles and practices of developing new solutions, new offerings for customers are the same regardless of industry. Some industries
Absolutely.
have very specific regulatory requirements or unique nuances to them, but the core principles, the core foundational principles remain the same. So that allows me to work across industries, keep it exciting, and I enjoy making a difference in the companies I work with.
Oh yeah, I can definitely identify with that. Sometimes even actually not being part of knowing that much about the industry can be beneficial when you're coming in through like an innovation space because you're not trapping yourself in the box that they might be trapped in.
Yeah, we do a
And
lot of benchmarking, so it
yeah.
sometimes we'll get asked, "Can you go outside of our industry? What are they doing in
Hmm.
short cycle time businesses like cell phones? Because where a cell phone is old if it's been on the shelf for more than 6 months, and are there some things in that industry that we could apply in our industry?" So there's definitely lots of lessons learned that cut across arenas or industries that are applicable, and I often get that request. And then there's how do we compare to our peers in our industry? So it's
Hmm.
important to be able to quantify where the performance gaps are. So that's an important part of helping to understand where we need to focus our efforts to make improvements.
Yeah, it's always helpful to look inside and outside your industry to see how people are creatively solving maybe the problem you might have. It's ideal. And you were mentioning that the engineering background you have in solving the processes. I have a biological background, and I think we're just naturally problem solvers. And I think that's the point is we want to go into other people, help them solve or innovate on something new. And I think we kind of just take that. Like I take a lot of the scientific method with me when I'm designing things to help people. So, and I'm sure you do the same, very similar things. Some of the practices you've had as an engineer come forward when you're helping people innovate.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And you're right, we are natural problem solvers. But one of the things I've learned over the years is not to jump too quickly to the problem, to the solution rather, before you
Yes.
really understand the problem. So
Yeah.
that's a big part of what I'm doing these days is really kind of making sure we understand the difference between being in the problem space and being in the
Hmm.
solution space. And
Hmm.
a lot of companies make the mistake, especially engineering driven companies or
Hmm.
science driven companies, of jumping too quickly to the solution before they understand the problem. And
I would
uh,
agree.
and that's problematic because you're often spending lots of money and scarce resources creating a solution that nobody wants. So it's important to understand the difference and to apply the different tools and techniques to manage that flow.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I often start thinking about that I'm actually helping teams decide more of what not to do, and that's a big piece right there. Just I know some of the tools we can always talk about tools, but yeah, some of the tools are just almost like filtering pieces to people so they can ask themselves the right questions of what's important to them and their company.
Yeah, and that's kind of brings up one of the roles of leadership is what is the box, what is the strategic box that we want to play in, the where to play,
Hmm.
and making sure that's clearly articulated. So when you have a team that's in that exploratory space looking for the right problems to solve, they're not looking at, flying cars or or something that's
Yeah,
not
yeah.
within the bounds of what we're good at and what the market trends are telling us. And do we have a right to play there based on our core competencies as an organization? So leadership needs to set those kind of upfront opportunity area boundaries and then turn the teams loose to go out and talk to customers and find out what are
Hmm.
the big important problems that they need solved. And then you get to the point where you can start thinking about how we're going to solve those problems.
Yeah, a lot of that starting with leadership. And since you brought up leadership, where do you find where's a common point where leaders kind of get stuck and when they're trying to decide what's next for their company?
Well, one of the things and one of the themes of the book is what I'm finding today is a lot of companies are kind of they're used to the annual planning cycle. So they might come every company has their annual operating plan and your long range plan, and these
Hmm.
typically start in September and take several months to come together with a plan for the year. They put that plan in place, set the budgets, and then they execute throughout the year. Whereas that doesn't work in most industries. That doesn't work so well today. The world's just changing too
Hmm.
quickly, as we know. The pace of
Hmm.
change in technology, in what's going on in the marketplace, customer behaviors is such that you have to have that ability to dynamically look at what's going on in the market, adjust your strategy if needed, adjust your priorities and your strategic priorities, and make sure that cascades down to the organization to the levels where they're making decisions on where we're going to put the resources, what projects we're going to approve, what are our project priorities going to be, because that's where the rubber meets the road is when you're putting people on projects because that's typically your scarce resource, and you need to make sure that that's happening dynamically throughout the year because
Hmm.
conditions are going to change more than they have before. So you need a process, you need a discipline really to be able to reconcile the two. So that disconnect between ambition and execution is what this the book is really all about. How do we connect the two in a way that makes sure that top-down plan is tracking the bottoms up is tracking to the top-down ambition, and often it's not. There's typically a gap, and how we're going to close that gap is the question that leadership needs to answer. And they need the data, they need the information to make informed decisions. So that's all those different moving parts, all those pieces are part of this dynamic process I'm describing called portfolio management.
Yeah, I think you touched on something along those lines as another piece. I think you touched on the excerpt I got from your book was, how from your perspective and what you've learned, how do organizations distinguish between like the good ideas and the ideas that actually deserve the resource and attention? Because they are, I mean, a business is a limited resource in its own sake for time, energy, and attention.
Yeah, there's no shortage of good ideas. So the challenge becomes
Hmm.
what is our criteria? Let's agree on the criteria for how we're going to evaluate these good ideas
Hmm.
relative to other opportunities we can invest in.
Hmm.
And so it's important to have evaluation criteria, not just financial, what's the NPV look like, what's the payback, but also there's some qualitative things you should be asking, and everybody should be aligned on what's the strategic fit, what's the opportunity for operational leverage that we have, what are some of the macro trends we're seeing in the marketplace, what are the growth markets, and where do we want to harvest a platform that's been out there for a while. So there's a combination of inputs, if you will, or criteria. Getting agreement on that, and then there nothing beats the right people sitting around the table and using that data and making informed decisions. Hopefully, those people are close to the market and the changes in the
Hmm.
market and the technology, and they need to make those decisions about what we're going to work on, what we're not going to work on. And as you mentioned earlier, many companies don't have the ability, don't aren't good at saying no to things.
Hmm.
So sometimes saying no to something helps your overall throughput. Instead of too many companies will load up their innovation pipelines to capacity and beyond and just say, yes, we want to do more, 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 but everything suffers when you do that. So
Yeah.
understanding that your metric is not how many projects you take on, it's that throughput, how many are getting out the other end of the funnel. And then of course you also have to not just look at individual project value, but as a portfolio, do we have
Hmm.
the right mix? Do we have the right mix of short term, medium term, longer term, of new products, adjacencies, and completely transformative
Hmm.
exploratory projects? What is that mix? What does our strategy dictate our mix needs to be? I once worked for a client who was frustrated because they were investing lots of money in R&D, a medical device company, and
Yeah.
they were growing, they weren't keeping up with their competition in terms of growth of the overall market, yet they were investing more than their peers in the industry. Yet
Hmm.
they wanted double digit growth year over year, but when you looked at their portfolio and characterized the portfolio, they were saying yes to a lot of incremental innovation or product line extensions, the safe
Hmm.
bets. And when you kind of
Okay.
peel back the layers, you recognize that you're not going to grow unless you have a more balanced portfolio with some investment in some of the higher risk reward kinds of opportunities. But
Mhm.
then we looked at the incentive plan, and the general managers at the business unit level on down, they were incented based on hitting their quarterly numbers. So of course they're gonna go for the one-offs or the safe
Mhm.
projects where they're going to maintain that quarter over quarter revenue. So they were there was a gap between their ambition and what their bottoms up plans are telling them. So we had
Mhm.
to give them the tools, the discipline to start migrating to a more balanced portfolio where they said no to some short-term things in order to fund some higher, longer-term, higher risk reward projects. And the incentive system ultimately had to change, and that's not easy to do. That's kind of the
Yeah.
third rail in a lot of organizations. And lots of other things changed, but we gave the business units the tools to free up capacity to create a more balanced portfolio. Whereas in the past, it was just we're going to just do these safe things and keep our numbers where they need to be.
So, in these larger companies with a lot of the bureaucracy that kind of moves around, how do you bridge that gap when you have the people that are just their sole focus is keeping the business alive? So they're going to go low risk versus the people who want to, innovate and move and grow and scale the company. How do you kind of get those two to see eye to eye without, going too risky and also, not doing anything?
Yeah, it starts with the strategy. So if your strategy is to grow, let's just say double digit growth, and then having the data to show kind of the bottoms up. If we do everything that we are currently, every approved project and the ones that are kind of waiting to get approved over the next 3 to 5 years, and
Mm-hmm.
we do a stacked revenue or stacked profit chart to show what the projections are going to be, how does that compare to our growth targets? And there's often a gap,
Mm-hmm.
especially after you risk reduce, because not every project's going to be the winner, and not every project's going to even make it to market. So showing with data where the gaps are is one way, and just coming to the realization that if we continue to do the product line extensions of this aging product pipeline, we're just never going to get the double-digit growth that our leaders are telling us we need to hit for a growth objective. So that's where you need to start thinking about a more balanced portfolio, and that's so setting the targets, understanding what your mix of projects is across different growth horizons, and then working towards that as you approve new projects at each phase of the project, making sure, looking back in and making sure you're trending towards a better mix in that portfolio. Really tough to do without if you're working off of disconnected spreadsheets. So there's tools out there that help with
Yeah.
regard to this kind of planning, where you can very quickly in real time see, oh, how are we tracking relative to our strategic goals. So that
Mm-hmm.
the standard chart that shows you our growth for our innovation pipeline, you can very visibly see it's that visibility into where the gaps are. We might be
Okay.
okay for the next few quarters, but a year from now or 2 years from now, we've got a gap to close, and we're not
Mm-hmm.
going to close it if we keep doing same things over and over. So the data helps inform that decision making, and then having alignment on those goals and what are the inputs that we're going to use to inform those decisions, whether it be charts and graphs, whether it be
Hmm.
individual project financials, whether it be kind of strategic priorities. Those all have to come together in a decision process with the right governance. And then where the rubber meets the road is where you start allocating resources to projects.
Is your IT infrastructure starting to feel like a bottleneck? Many growing leaders hit a point where technical debt slows their team down and keeps their best engineers stuck in constant firefighting. That's where Kevin Weber at Polyfortech comes in. At Polyfortech, Kevin does more than just consult on your infrastructure challenges. He acts as a fractional CTO who actually gets in the trenches with your team to modernize your systems and migrate to the cloud. If building technical debt is slowing your business growth, then set up a call with Kevin at polyfortech.com. That's Polyfortech, POLYFORTECH.com. Hey, are you spinning your wheels trying to figure out what will really boost your business's bottom line? At Emberry Solutions, our Profit Priority Workshop is here to cut through the noise. We help you zero in on what truly matters, aligning your team, optimizing your processes, and magnifying your profits. Imagine your business running smoother than ever, with every decision and effort leading straight to increased profits. That's what focusing on the right priorities can do. Ready to boost your efficiency and profits? Visit Emberry Solutions and let's start making your business work smarter. At Emberry Solutions, we take your business from bottlenecks to breakthroughs. Now, I work with teams that are kind of like they have something established. They have something established. Now they're kind of looking up from their bootstrapping and what's next. And that's why I like to hop in. Now you're working on innovation, creating products. Once you bridge that strategy and start creating something that they can execute on that strategy, how do you, what do you look at as continuous improvement? I like to call what I do as micro pivots because the target doesn't always stay stationary, and you want to take your smaller tasks and well, essentially experiment with them to find out and ask yourself, what's moving this forward, what's holding us back, and what can we do next? You have something similar to that?
Yeah, so at the individual project level, I think of one way to answer your question is if it's truly an exploratory new opportunity that you're going after and there's a lot of uncertainty, you
Mm-hmm.
should still have that North Star. What is the value we're going to provide to the customer?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and um, and you want to learn very quickly. So you want to get out, talk to customers. You want to run experiments with customers to validate any unknowns in your business case,
Mm-hmm.
or you're making sure that there's truly a problem worth solving, and also that and maybe there's some technology uncertainty as well. But typically, it's the and let's make sure we're solving the right problem for the customer, and let's get out and
Mm-hmm.
talk to customers and make sure we're doing that. So when we learn, as we're learning and de-risking, it's okay to pivot, but that North Star or that strategy typically doesn't change as frequently. Now, if
Mm-hmm.
market conditions change, that's another reason you might pivot or change direction slightly, or say it's no longer valid. Let's put these resources on something else. So it's a
Yeah.
continuous learning process, but the investment in rapid learning is really at that front end where the uncertainty is greatest. Once you're into the development phases of a project and it's kind of turned the crank, okay, we know we're onto it. We validated the solution is going to meet the customer need. It's got a viable business model. Let's start developing. But where companies make the mistake most is they move to execution too quickly before really validating and de-risking up front. So
Mm-hmm.
learning how to do that quickly with the right set of learning metrics versus ROIs in the early stages is
Mm-hmm.
is going to save you money and resources, because resources really start ramping when you get to the execution stage in whatever industry you're in.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it be medical devices or semiconductors or a consumer product.
That's
So
cool.
understanding when you need to be agile and de-risk, and when it's okay, there's
Yeah, yeah.
enough knowns that we can start executing and scaling an opportunity.
I could go on all day bouncing off these questions. I find this stuff completely fascinating because it's similar to what I enjoy doing as well. But I would like to ask a little bit more about your book, Innovation, Portfolio Management, Linking Strategy to Execution. So what are you really pointing at for companies or a reader to get out of this?
Yeah, I wrote the book as more of a how to create and improve this discipline called portfolio
Mhm.
management. There's lots of books on innovation. There's some
Mhm.
books on portfolio management, but very few that are a practical how-to guide. How do we build the capability? So I've spent the
Mhm.
last 30 plus years helping companies do just that, to build the capability. And over time, I've created a methodology for helping companies design, pilot, and roll out these disciplines that we've been talking about. So I decided to put it down in a book. The book starts out by first defining what do we mean by portfolio management. Let's level set on what that is. Um,
Mhm.
of course, there's a maturity model. What level of maturity are we relative to? Are we completely unstructured, and how do we get to the point where we're world class? So, understanding where you are on that maturity spectrum,
Mhm.
um, and then the book really switches to the how to, and I basically walk through everything from governance to evaluation criteria, resource management, setting up your portfolio structure. What are your inclusion criteria? What should be in and out of the portfolio? So there's about 9 or 10 different elements of a portfolio management system that we walk through in the book. I walk through each one of those and describe some good practices, lessons learned, and then what I've done is I've weaved in some case studies. So I interviewed about 20 different executives that have gone through this journey and got their take on what worked, what didn't work. So there's lots of good case studies throughout the book to kind of reinforce so it's not so process heavy. There's some real life examples of how companies have
Excellent.
succeeded or lessons that they've learned when they haven't succeeded. And then the last part of the book is probably the hardest part of all this. It's about organizational change management. If you're designing a new process and it's not used, it's worthless. So how do
Mhm.
we get the organization to adopt these new practices? So there's a lot of on leadership's role in over helping the organization overcome resistance to change
Mhm.
and building a capability that really sticks. So lots of good lessons learned, again with case studies on overcoming some of those cultural barriers for change. And then of course, and then I wrap it up by talking about software tools. There's a whole chapter on the different software systems that are out there that enable these practices,
Mhm.
including and I talk about how they're incorporating AI into their solutions. And then and then I close it out with a discussion on something that I see as a trend is innovation ecosystem. So not just developing products or solutions for your customers within your four walls, but how do you work with partners? Because to deliver value to the end user, you're often
Mhm.
there's an ecosystem of partners you need to work with in order to deliver that value to the customer. So how do you manage an ecosystem in a portfolio framework? So there's lots of unique considerations to think about when you're dealing with the external partners or the different types of ways you get that product to market.
Wow, that'd be really valuable. You kept on using a build capability. So when does a company know that they're capable of this style of innovation?
Well, the maturity model is one way to kind of see where are we in terms of our level of maturity. So in the book there's a 4 stage maturity model, and I
Mhm.
characterize how do you know when you're in one of these different stages. So that's more of a qualitative approach. The other approach is the benchmarking we talked about earlier. Um,
Mhm.
how does our performance line up relative to other companies? So
Okay.
what's our resource utilization look like relative to others in our industry or outside of our
Mhm.
industry? How often do we kill projects? What is our schedule predictability? Um, what is our performance in market relative to our plan? What are our cycle times? So these are all metrics that you can compare to other companies and see where the gaps are. And what I like about benchmarking is it's hard to argue with that. Lots of stakeholders in an organization have their own opinions on why things are not better, but it's
Mhm.
hard to argue with just the numbers, what the numbers are telling us. How are we performing in in time to market versus the 5 or 6 other leaders in our industry? What is the gap? And then we can start focusing on, okay, what is the best way to close that gap? And you kind of roadmap out the change plan. But you anchor the team, the leaders, the stakeholders on. Let's all agree that we have room for improvement.
Okay.
And using the numbers is a very effective way to get everybody on the same page there.
That's awesome. Oh, that's great. I like the Yeah, your metrics in your different ways, kind of a qualitative and quantitative ways of the business looking at itself. When it comes to, since you've been, like I say, you've interviewed a lot of different, you said 20 different companies, was it?
Yeah, executives from 20 different companies.
Perfect.
And
When you were interviewing these, what were some of the trends that you were seeing that the leaders aren't preparing for but should be?
good question. Yeah. So, well, one of them is the ecosystem part of it. Just being too internally focused. So,
Hmm.
you could have a great product, but if there's different elements outside of your company that are needed to deliver the value to the end user, and there's plenty of examples of this, then you're gonna be blindsided, and you're gonna miss the mark. Um, there were examples, for example, on the topic of governance. I talked to one executive who had a situation where it was he was the head of R&D. He sat at corporate, and then they
Hmm.
had autonomous business, four different autonomous business units, and those
Hmm.
business units were not hitting their growth targets. And they kept going back to corporate saying, I want you to fund a more breakthrough kind of product so we can really accelerate our growth. And corporate would turn back to them and say, you guys need to fund your own. You need to manage a portfolio to where you free up capacity to fund your own mix of projects instead of just going after the short term, kind of like what we talked about before.
Yeah, yeah.
So to break that cycle of, corporate needs to pay for it, they told a story. There's kind of a hybrid approach where corporate would fund the the really the really breakthrough ideas that really showed promise as more of an acceleration, but they gave the individual business unit the tools to manage their own portfolio. So if you did get corporate funding for a, let's say, an exploratory project that wouldn't deliver value for 3, 4, or 5 years down the road, then that project all of a sudden got a lot of attention throughout the organization. So they had this mix of empowering the business units to manage their own portfolios, giving them the capabilities and the tools to do that, to have the right mix of projects to hit their growth
Hmm.
target. But there was also a mechanism for funding. I'd call it an accelerated type of funding for those truly exploratory that the business units just didn't have the capacity to fund on their own. But it was the exception rather than the rule, and they were
Hmm.
migrating to a model where future state the business unit had to fund those and not be so reliant on corporate.
Hmm. All right. Wow, I like that. I mean, that's kind of innovation within innovation. I like how they were the approach of
Well, there's different, and
letting their team work.
it highlights the different levels of governance. There's governance at the business unit level, and then there's
Yeah.
governance for that truly breakthrough products that might cut across business units. When you're sitting at corporate, in some of these large corporations, you have corporate, you have the segments, then under the segment you have multiple business units, then under business units you have product lines. So there's a lot of levels to that hierarchy. So knowing where the decision making happens and what kinds of decisions rights there are is
Hmm.
can be a challenge. So
Yeah.
what's appropriate for to make decisions at the segment or corporate level versus the business unit level. So figuring all that out is part of the design of the capability that we talk about.
No, that's
So
good.
there's some
Okay.
there's some good lessons I've learned over the years of making sure that the people closest to the problems are the ones making the decisions, and
Yeah.
especially the ones that are allocating the resources. And that's typically at the business unit level where you're going to set up the governance for the pipeline of projects in that business unit. But projects that cut across business units or platforms, they might require the governance to be at a higher level, at a segment or corporate level, because it affects multiple business units. So understanding those trade-offs and setting up a structure that supports the right decisions at the right place can be challenging in these large organizations. But once you have that up, you get less hallway conversations and more definitive
Yeah.
decision
The
making
water
at the
cooler
right.
talks. I mean, that's gonna be some valuable stuff you have in your book there for untying those, because I can imagine that there's a lot of people asking, and I've seen it myself. It's just like, who is the decision maker? When can we make independent decisions? And what can we move forward with without having the whole table turned on us? So, going from that, it wouldn't be about the business of what's next if I didn't ask you, what's next in your own work?
Well, one more kind of comment on
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
kind of ties into that answer. We haven't talked much about the cultural side of what we're dealing
True.
with. And one thing about this discipline of innovation portfolio management is that it cuts across functions. So
Hmm.
people that might have had power in the old way, like maybe the R&D leader made all the project prioritizations and funding decisions. Now
Hmm.
these decisions affect manufacturing, they affect regulatory, they affect quality,
Hmm.
they affect marketing. So there's often a lot of resistance when that power is shifting to more of a centralized model, or a model that's more that cuts across those functions, or cuts across regions, and
Hmm.
that can be a real challenge. So I'm always learning every day on how to improve the cultural side
Hmm.
of what we do. I get the privilege of walking into a lot of different organizations, and there are those organizations where you have this fear of failure mentality,
Hmm.
where teams get beat up if they don't hit their targets, that sort of thing, or if they're in that exploratory space, the leaders asking them, when am I going to see an ROI, when they haven't even validated that there's a solution that
Hmm.
meets the needs of the customer yet. So knowing what the right questions to ask at the right time, instead of asking, when will I see that? Give me, you know, let me know how we can move in the date by 3 months. Don't just say move the date in by 3 months.
Yeah.
Come back to me, team, with three recommendations, or your recommendations on how to do that. So that nuance in asking the question the right way, and pushing the decision making to the right place in that hierarchy is so critical, and it's actions, not words, that really the employees of the organization are going to recognize. Those signals that leadership is sending
Hmm.
says a lot about the kind of culture that they're in. And if you want a culture where you have empowered teams that are coming up with ideas, and being very action oriented, you have to foster that kind of environment. So the cultural side is really the hardest part of all of this, and it's the part where I think companies, have a lot more work to do on that improvement cycle.
Oh, I totally agree. I also see on some of the flip side of that is when the team lets you in and you get to do work, you actually start seeing the culture change in a positive direction because you may be giving those team members buy-in, or at least they're able to share their intellectual knowledge. Just even that opportunity can do move mountains when it comes to improving the culture.
Yeah, people are more likely to adopt the changes if they are the ones that created it. So
Absolutely, 100%.
in, go, involving the key stakeholders in the design of the new way of working
Hmm.
is just so critical.
Absolutely.
And I mean, the alternative is to drop a cookie cutter, or have, kind of a top down approach. You're going to do it
Hmm.
this way. If you involve the people that are closest to the problems in coming up with that future state, and there's ways to do that I get into in the book, but it's so important, because adoption should be one of the key metrics. How are people adopting the new processes, the tools, and if the best way to get them to adopt it is to involve them, even in the front end, when you're looking at where the gaps are, the performance gaps are, and the
Right.
benchmarking, and the opportunity gaps. Involving them every step of the way is so critical, and they're going to have ideas leadership didn't think of, because they're
Oh yeah,
closer to the
and
problem.
it's I've always find it humbling for leadership when they have all their ideas out and they're like, well, this is what really needs to happen, and all of theirs are left on the cutting room floor. And when people collectively say, no, these are the challenges we need to overcome, or these are the, depending on what they're working on, the pieces we need to hit to meet our ROI. It's usually a good wake up call in a very positive way, in fact, because everybody has their ideas out there and go, hey, mine wasn't chosen because I saw one better.
Yeah. And as you're
Yeah.
implementing the lessons learned, if you're
Hmm.
implementing a new portfolio review approach that is less about status and more about decision making, which I obviously advocate very heavily for,
Hmm.
let's stick around for 15 minutes after the meeting and talk about what went right, what went wrong. What are
Yes.
some of the behavior? Are we demonstrating the behaviors that we said we would when the teams are in the room? And let's get better at this. So it's really important to do the postmortems on
Hmm.
projects, on portfolio reviews, on gate meetings, and really just having that continuous improvement mindset is so critical.
I 100% agree. That's great. Great way to end this. I really wanted to ask though, what is next? I'm going back to that question. I got to get that in. So what's next for you? What's next for your business, and where are you taking it forward to?
I'm doing a lot of research in the ecosystem portfolio management area. You may have heard the term ambidextrous innovation. So how do companies manage their core business, their execution engine
Hmm.
of new product development, and at the same time create completely new sources of growth? There's lots that have been written. There's lots of research that's been done about ambidexterity and being able to walk
Hmm.
and chew gum at the same time.
Hmm.
But actually getting it done and putting it into more practical applicable methodologies so companies
Hmm.
start acting on that is so critical. So if you try to do something that's very exploratory or out there in terms of uncertainty, the core business antibodies are gonna attack it. It's not going to get very far, especially when it comes to sharing resources with the thing is not going to produce a return for many years. So
Hmm.
how do you do both? How do you do both at the same time simultaneously is critical, and it often requires completely different approaches. One more agile, one more about test and learn, and the other more about execution of the known. So doing both at the same time is an area that I've spent quite a bit of time helping companies with, but I think there's more to learn there.
Sounds like a second book.
Yeah, we'll see. This one, by the way, isn't launching till September. Available for
Okay.
pre-order now, but I haven't even birthed this one yet. So I haven't
No,
even
that's what I
I'm
was just
not
going to
even
ask
thinking
you.
about a second one.
So they can
What I
pre-order you.
might do though, Matt, is do I've got some workshops to do as a nice follow-on to the book. So
Oh, excellent.
for companies that need help, maybe like a 2 hour or a couple day,
Hmm.
3 day workshop to help them get started in these disciplines and get better. That's something I can see doing next, kind of like
Okay.
more of a hands-on.
Hmm.
Let's get in there and create this together and learn by doing as opposed to spending months defining a process. Let's actually get the foundational elements up and running, and
Hmm.
let's start actually doing it and getting better year over year, quarter over quarter at this discipline called portfolio management.
Yeah. Okay. And then if somebody wants to reach out, if they're curious about your workshops and curious about maybe pre-ordering your book, where can they find you?
LinkedIn's the best way.
Okay.
Just find me. You can find me on LinkedIn, and I post a lot,
Hmm.
so different articles, and there's links in there to go to my firm's website where you can read more about the book, I'm doing a bunch of giveaways. Like you can get the first chapter for free right now. So, but starting with my LinkedIn page is the best place to start, and then you can shoot me a note. Happy to hear from you, and anybody, and I love talking about this stuff, and hopefully there's ways that we can help each other.
All right. And as always, I'll have those links in the show notes. If anybody didn't catch that, you're driving the car and you want to come back to it later and click on the link, find them on LinkedIn, message Noel, and ask them about those workshops where the implementation get an early start. If you can't wait for the book, because you gotta get innovating now with your company. um, be a great time to take that leap. All right, Noel, I really liked what you brought forward to this. This speaks to you aligned really well with like how I like helping teams and you like teams. The problem solving question science kind of background approach, and I like that your blend of how to help these companies blend their risks and innovation so they can get to the next level in their business. Again, thanks to God, there was a lot there to learn. I hope listeners enjoyed this. Noel, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, Matt. It's a pleasure.
All right.